Or do you? Okay. Do you want me to say something?
No, I'll introduce all of us and then we'll start getting into the questions.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
So, good evening. My name is Ana Nunez, and on behalf of the Pomona Student Union, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Rape Culture, a discussion of myths, realities, and potential solutions. We would like to thank Pomona's advocates for survivors of sexual assault for being here with us tonight. Given the sensitivity of tonight's discussion, advocates are here, there's one at the back door, to provide individuals with support and counseling should anyone need it during tonight's event. Please feel free to seek out their help at any point during tonight. The Pomona Student Union is a nonpartisan, student-run organization committed to increasing the level of open and honest dialogue at Pomona and in the broader community. We challenge assumptions and present a range of perspectives through speeches, discussions, and debates on important issues. By presenting speakers with varying perspectives, we strive to engage critical thinking and promote intellectual diversity. In doing so, we hope to encourage further conversations and to push ourselves to ask the difficult questions. The PSU does not endorse or support the viewpoints of any of the speakers at tonight's event. What we do is encourage you to take this discussion further and to challenge assumptions while debating this topic with others. For more information about the PSU and to sign up for our mailing list, please visit our website at psu.pomona.edu, where you can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at PSU. And please join us for our upcoming event on November 10th discussing the favelas of Brazil. The term rape culture was first used by feminists in the 1970s in their efforts to discuss the public in an effort to educate the public about the prevalence of rape. The 1974 book Rape, the first source book for women, the 1975 book Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, and the documentary film Rape Culture are among the earliest works that draw attention to the pervasiveness of rape, use the specific term rape culture, and call for a societal transformation. Today, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network cites that 1 in 6 American women and 1 in 33 American men have been a victim of an attempted or completed rape in her or his lifetime. 73% of these assaults were completed by a non-stranger, and only 3% of rapists will serve a day in prison. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 19% of undergraduate women experience attempted or completed sexual assault since entering college. Currently, 76 colleges and universities are under investigation by the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights for Title IX violations and handling complaints of sexual assault. Tonight we are joined by Andrea Pino, Conrad Whittle, and Zerlina Maxwell. Andrea Pino was one of the primary writers and one of the 5 complainants in the 2013 Title IX and Clery Act complaints against the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is a co-founder of End Rape on Campus, an organization that helps students across the country file Clery Title IX and Title II complaints, as well as to organize for policy reform on their campuses. She helped write the bipartisan Campus Safety and Accountability Act and works closely with Senator Kristen Gillibrand. Conrad Whittle has a BA in philosophy, an MA in forensic psychology, and is a retired police officer and the owner of Whittle Self-Defense in Northern California. He is the developer of the Recover model of therapeutic self-defense, an empowerment-based program that works in tandem with traditional therapeutic methods for survivors of violence-related trauma. He has worked with Sacramento's Women Escaping a Violent Environment and Placer County Stand Up Placer. Zerlina Maxwell is a political writer and analyst who appears on MSNBC and Fox News as a Democratic commentator. She is a contributing writer for Ebony.com, Mike.com, and RHRRealityCheck.org, and her writing has also appeared in the New York Daily News, the Washington Post, and Marie Claire magazine, among others. She writes about national politics, candidates, and specific policy and culture issues, including domestic violence, sexual assault, victim blaming, and gender inequality. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers. Tonight's event will begin with a question addressed to each speaker individually, and then we will continue with 2 more questions addressed to the entire panel. After each question, the panelists will be able to have time to respond to each other, and then we will conclude by taking questions from the audience. Let's get started. So the first question is addressed to Zerlina. Zerlina, can you tell us what is a rape culture? You'll have 7 minutes to respond, and then each of the other panelists will have a minute to add their own thoughts.
Sure. I thank you so much for having me and for organizing this, Anna. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there with you today. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there. I fell and I broke my foot, so I was not advised to get on a plane to fly cross country. But just to get to the definition, I actually pulled out a definition that I like to use often, and I used it recently in the November issue of Essence magazine, which is on newsstands now. I had a piece there about rape culture, and so it's from the book Transforming a Rape Culture, which was written in 1993. So it was not in the 70s when all of the things you were citing came out, and there were so many important feminists doing work trying to find the language to describe what I think so many of us will understand after we go through this panel. So just the definition that I had from Transforming a Rape Culture, it's a complex set of beliefs that encourages male sexual aggression and supports violence against women. It is a society where where violence is seen as sexy and sexuality as violent. Women perceive a continuum of threatened violence that ranges from sexual remarks to sexual touching, and then at the end of the spectrum to rape itself. So that's the textbook definition. But the way in which I see it is, I'm a lawyer by training. And so the way that I see it is I break it down into different elements when I try to explain what rape culture looks like and how it manifests to people who are unfamiliar with the term. And the way that I like to break it down is the default position when someone comes forward and says, I have been sexually assaulted or I have been abused. And the response is to blame that person, right? So victim blaming is, I would say, the number one most pervasive element of rape culture as I understand it. And then I would also say empathy with the perpetrators goes, it's part and parcel with victim blaming. So it's really this idea that rape is something that is inevitable, that if it happens to you, you must have done something to bring that about. And that is really the default response in our society, unfortunately. And I think that we can point to a number of different examples and see how it manifests in a lot of different areas. For example, if you just use the Ray Rice second video in the NFL, that recent controversy, right? You wouldn't think necessarily that in and of itself is an example of rape culture, but it is, because rape culture is a spectrum, so domestic violence is on this spectrum of violence. And we saw when the first video came out, a lot of people, and the NFL included, participated in blaming Janae Rice for being punched out. And there's really nothing more ridiculous than that. So I think that, obviously I don't think that's 7 minutes, but I think that that's how I understand it. There's a lot of different elements that manifest in different contexts, but I think that victim blaming is the one true continuing thread throughout. And it's the one in which I think that, we can work very hard to end that one, certainly by, as individuals, choosing to support people who come to us and say they've been abused. I think that would be step one. So that's just a basic definition of rape culture, and I know that Drea and the other panelists here have a lot of expertise to share as well on the issue.
Thank you. Would either of the other panelists like to add their thoughts to that?
Yeah, so jumping on what Elizabeth said about the Ray Rice controversy, I think another great example of rape culture and its pervasiveness is the Halloween costumes that anyone has seen of Ray Rice and Janae Rice. I think the fact that I saw a child in blackface doing a Cabbage Patch doll that is also in blackface with a B9 just shows how pervasive rape culture is. It's the fact that we actually make it humorous, we make it something that is tolerated. And rather than there being a deterrence for rape, there's a deterrence for coming forward. So the way we look at rape culture is survivors are less likely to come forward, perpetrators are more likely to rape because we have this tolerance of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think my question actually is kind of directed at this. The fundamental purpose of any culture is to pass on traditions or beliefs which is ultimately manifested in behavior. And so that's kind of what I'm going to talk about when I answer my question is, you're talking about behavior. That's what any culture is about.
Right, so going to that, the second question, Conrad, how does rape culture manifest and become perpetrated in our everyday lives?
So probably one of the most, if anybody's familiar with the work of Jean Kilborn, she's been studying advertising for 40 years. She did all the Killing Us Softly documentaries. And in the last one, it was, again, fabulous work, but it was somewhat depressing because here's somebody who has just a wealth of knowledge. And she said something very powerful in her video, which is that she actually feels that it's getting worse, not better. And I think that was manifested in the Ohio rape case, where you had these two football players who raped an unconscious female. But there was something that was very interesting in that case, in that one of the witnesses actually stopped one of the suspects from driving drunk. He literally forcefully took the keys away. But when he walked in on a sexual assault, a naked female, unconscious, lying next to a puddle of puke, he said, "See you guys at practice on Monday?" This is courtroom testimony. And they said, "See you at practice on Monday." When he was asked why he didn't stop what he was seeing, he said he didn't think it was rape. He basically said that rape had to be violent. So where do we get these beliefs? There was a study back in 1967 of college students that showed that 25% of college students whose actions met the criteria of rape, even though the women were crying and fighting back, did not think they were committing a rape. So where do we get that belief from? There was a study that showed that 1 out of every 8 American-made movies depicts a rape scene if you count a rape scene as the scenes that start as a rape but finish as consensual sex. And there's classic examples of this that I use all the time in all different types of scenes where somebody's fighting, they're saying no, they're saying stop, and then the music changes, the scene changes, and all of a sudden it turns to consensual sex. As if that's an accurate depiction of female sexuality. Comic books, it's now pervasive in comic books. We have what are called women in refrigerator scenes in comic books. It started with a Green Lantern episode where Green Lantern comes home and he finds the villain in the comic book has cut up his girlfriend and put her in the refrigerator. There's jokes on television, Family Guy episodes, where we joke about rape. The word rape should be treated the way we use race terms. When you really think about it, it's something that we should draw the type of attention to the way that we have drawn attention to derogatory racial terms. But we now use rape in the culture of video games where when somebody blows somebody up, they say, "Oh, I just raped you." And by doing that, we're normalizing behavior that's just incredibly damaging to 50% of the population. And of course, that doesn't even count the LGBT community and males and people that are disenfranchised from even reporting or talking about the subject.
Thank you. This third question is addressed to you, Andrea. How does rape culture manifest in a college environment, and how does it affect survivors navigate their experience?
Yeah, so I would say it's definitely exacerbated on college campuses, and a lot of what I was actually going to touch on when it comes to reporting rape is, rape statutes are very different across all 50 states. And if you ever want to have a fun time, look up, the rape statutes in Alabama and what they're it's literally ancient times. It's like one person of the opposite sex touching someone else, and it's just, in many states, if you're male, you're not considered a survivor. In North Carolina, for example, it's only penile vaginal penetration. And, even women who are anally raped don't count, it doesn't count as rape. If you're male, it's counted as a sex offense, and oftentimes that's not prosecuted. So oftentimes you have these barriers beyond college campuses, and the fact that literally, what happened to you isn't considered a crime. So what we're seeing in college campuses, there isn't a deterrence for it because it's not considered a crime. It's considered something that's part of college culture. I'll never forget my first time walking to a fraternity party, or my first time in orientation, just 6 years ago, and what it was like being told that if I touched a blue light, I would be safe. Or, I could see a blue light from my dorm, I could see, and if I was standing at that one, I could see one, just across the street.
and everything seemed safe. And I was told that, if I was with friends, if I carried a whistle on me, if I carried pepper spray on me, then I'd be okay. And by my 3rd week of college, I experienced my first sexual assault, and by my sophomore year, I was raped. And I learned after the end of my sophomore year that of the 36 women in my hall, my dorm, 17 of us had been sexually assaulted by the time we finished our sophomore year. And all of our stories didn't match what we were told in orientation. We all were with our friends when it happened, or we were with our partners, or we were in safe situations, and it happened. And we were told, basically, it was a script that sexual assault, was the person that jumped in the bushes. It wasn't the person that was in our political science class, or the person that was in our sports team, or the person that we had a crush on, or the person that we went on a date with. It was somebody that wasn't part of our community. And what I'm seeing, at every college campus is that we don't talk about perpetrators being of our community. We talk about them, we other them. And because of that, it happens. We don't deter the problem. We don't say, if you do this is considered sexual assault. It's always like, what did you do to cause this? And I think, what Anna was saying, it's actually 80 schools now that are under investigation. But all these schools are coming under fire. You have schools as powerful as Harvard, schools as small as Occidental that are in that list, but nothing's actually changing. You can have schools come under fire, and you have schools who are being criticized nationally, but it doesn't mean people are being expelled. And because of that, students have it's that chilling effect. Even if my school's under fire by the federal government, nothing's changing. Just my alma mater right now, rape reports haven't increased. None of the perpetrators that were implicated in the federal complaint were expelled. And actually, I know hundreds of survivors, not a single person I've ever met has had their rapist prosecuted or expelled. And these are hundreds of people. And the way it looks is, it just seems as if you go to college to not only get the title, your bachelor's degree, you're going to get a title of survivor. And that's just how it is. And it just seems as if it's something that nobody really cares about. And I think it's just over-exacerbated because we are all young people, right? When we're going to school to get an education. We're not going to be assaulted. But at the same time, schools are indifferent to it. And it just continues.
Thank you. Conrad or Zerlina, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think one of the things that I always like to talk about when I'm talking about sexual assault in the context of campuses is that I think there's a generational gap between maybe our parents' generation. I don't know what generation I'm in. I'm a millennial technically, but I'm not in college, so I'm sort of in this in-between space. And I think there's a generational divide when we talk about this because young people, it's so normalized. Sexual assault is so normalized. I think about studies in New York City, for example, done by Girls for Gender Equity, and they found that kids that are in, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, and even younger, constantly looking at pornography on their cell phones, and then not having any language or anyone to really go to explain what they're seeing, and to talk about healthy messaging, they're trying out some of these behaviors on each other. And so this is younger than college. And so one of the things I think that we need to begin doing, not only when we're talking about rape culture on campuses, not only when we're talking about rape culture in a situation like Ray Rice where that's adults, but we have to talk to kids who are younger and younger, because by the time they get to college, it's pretty much over in terms of teaching people the right behaviors. And so, like Conrad said in the beginning, this all goes down to changing behaviors that have become normalized. So catcalling and rape jokes and sexism that dictates that little kids make fun of each other by saying "you throw like a girl" as an insult. Those are all things a part of the same spectrum to dehumanize and make women less than men. And that's the way in which it makes it really, really easy for them to become victimized. And not to say that women are the only ones being assaulted, that's not true. We've already said that. But I think that it's a lot of different things that manifest before you even get to college. And so I just wanted to point that out.
I would just add that it's often overlooked that ultimately, I used to be a police officer for the city of Sacramento, which is, it's not big like LAPD, but it's not small either. And, crime is primarily a male phenomenon, especially when you're talking about, violent crime. The statistics are overwhelming. And we tend to navigate away from that fact that ultimately crisis is a result of masculinity and the way that we socialize, period. That's what the stats are. Women just don't go out and commit the types of violent, heinous crime that men do. And any level that is statistically significant in comparison. Whether you're talking about school shooters or violence or murder, men are committing a tremendous amount of crime on other men, women, and children. And even when you look on male-on-male violence, you're actually far more likely to be assaulted or even murdered in this room if you're another guy. It's just we don't care about that because that's just boys being boys. But that's the reality of it. Women and children make much better, stories. It's easier to sensationalize. It pulls on our heartstrings. And it becomes a profit-based motive as opposed to actually striking at the heart of the problem, which is masculinity and the way that we define it.
Thank you. This next question. The National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism cites that 1/2 of sexual assault cases involve alcohol consumption by the perpetrator, victim, or both. The report notes that a woman's alcohol consumption may place her at an elevated risk of assault, but she is still in no way responsible for the attack. The conversation surrounding alcohol and sexual assault is one that continually creates a lot of tension and confusion. In your opinion, how should we talk about this cited phenomenon, and what should we do about it in general and on college campuses? Andrea, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think it's definitely important for us to go to the root of the problem, and it's the fact that, rape is a crime. Because oftentimes we have this narrative be shifted as, what if the victim hadn't been drinking, would this have been prevented? Just to give an anecdote, I was completely sober during my rape. My perpetrator wasn't. There were plenty of sober witnesses. It still happened, right? And actually, in my case, I was an athlete. I was much stronger than a lot of my friends. I had plenty of people who had been educated as bystanders in that party where I was assaulted, and nobody intervened. And that's really because it felt safe, right? And back to what I was saying earlier, we don't think that these things can happen in our intimate spaces. And when it comes to alcohol, it really is a scapegoat for this. We know that alcohol is one of the most prevalent drugs that is used to assault people, right? But we're not really talking about that. We're not really talking about what it is that's different between sex and rape, right? And how those are different. And I think what's happening in California is going to really set a model for what's hopefully going to happen in other states. What if we can completely rewrite what sex and rape is and how it's understood? What about the yes means yes bill is going to change how sexual assault is looked at on college campuses? And I think y'all are really going to be the experiment for that. What is that going to look like? What is it going to be when someone's accused and the law is written as in if there is no yes, then it's considered sexual assault. And it's going to be scary. Back to what he was saying earlier about pornography, what we are taught about sexual assault, about sex is really from pornography and from our society, because people don't talk about sex. They don't talk about sex in my home state of Florida. They definitely don't talk about sex in North Carolina. And it really isn't until we come to college that we really are thrusted into that environment. And alcohol really does become that scapegoat. It's like, well, I wasn't thinking, we were all drunk, we didn't know what was happening. And it really isn't until you read those statistics and you talk to other people that you recognize that what's happening is not okay. And I think, we really need to start having that conversation earlier and really start talking about how it is that alcohol is really a weapon in committing sexual assault.
Conrad?
So to kind of build off what Andrew's talking about, if you look at what's the primary motive for alcohol consumption, it's to lower inhibitions. Well, then you have to ask, well, what are the inhibitions related to? And of course, that's, to a certain extent, the desire that we all have sexually. It's one of, if you look at Maslow's hierarchies, you have sex on the bottom tier of basic needs, and then it comes in again at intimacy and belongingness. So sex is there, we're not getting rid of it. Alcohol's there, we're not getting rid of it. Prohibition was a dismal failure. So it didn't work, it's not going to work again. So the question really is, why are we using alcohol to lower our inhibitions? It's because we don't have a good dialogue about sex. And that primarily comes from the divide. So you can look at a comparative situation like in Europe where they consume a lot of alcohol. I was raised European, my mother's from Holland, and I grew up having alcohol as like they do over there. You have sips of alcohol. It was never a thing where I felt this desire to go out and binge drink, and then give me a reason for why, I ended up acting crazy. And that's really what alcohol is doing in our culture, because we don't have these conversations, because sex is so complex in the sense that we really put a ton of pressure on women. I mean, think about it. Have you ever heard of a story of a man, a young boy who ended up having sex, and then people ridiculed him to the point of committing suicide? You ever heard that story? But it happens for women. Women have committed suicide, young girls, because they chose to have sex, and then their own peer group tormented them so much over the choice that they felt the need to commit suicide. That's how much pressure is placed on female sexuality. That's the burden that we place. One person gets to be the center, and there's no problem with it, and the other person has to try to walk this boundary of being pure and virginal. And what does alcohol serve? It allows you to just wipe that away with an excuse, and that's why we binge drink in this country.
Serlina?
Well, I think with alcohol, I think about it as a facilitator of rape. I don't think that the presence of alcohol in so many cases of sexual assault, means that, oh, well, if you hadn't been drinking, it would have been all good. Because I just think that, that's really a naive way of thinking about it. Because if you were a person, that's over 21 or even under, and you've, gone out a few times, you had a couple drinks with your friends, every single time you're doing that, someone could decide to rape you that time, right? And it doesn't have anything to do with your drinking. You could be drinking, you could be sober. If you are in a room, someone who makes the decision to commit rape, then you're going to be a survivor. And it doesn't have anything to do with, your series of choices that night or any other night. And so I think the alcohol, like Drea said, it's a distraction from really what we need to be talking about with which is consent. Because if we have a really clear understanding of what consent is, what enthusiastic consent is, we're not going to be doing things with people who aren't really excited about it also. If we set the standard that that's the way that we're going to treat each other in our intimate relationships, we're going to have a lot healthy interactions, and we're not going to have so many instances where people are saying, you assaulted me, or instances where people are assaulted, because I think that we just have a clear understanding going in to those situations of what consent is, what we're willing to do and what we're not willing to do, regardless of the alcohol. Because the alcohol is just really, it's a distraction. A lot of people like playing alcohol, with that unfortunate song too, which is another manifestation of rape culture, by the way. But I think that the alcohol is really just a distraction from really that people need to have a clear understanding of consent and what a healthy relationship looks like before they're really engaging in sex.
Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add?
Yeah, I think to add on to that, I think what I also see too is schools just blaming it on kids being kids, right? I mean, a very high-profile case at Emerson College in Boston, you had the high-profile lawyers talking about, how Emerson couldn't be held accountable for what drunk kids were doing in their dorm rooms. They were acknowledging that it may not have been consensual, but because they were drunk and they were kids and they were experimenting, then it was fine, right? So oftentimes it is really used as that scapegoat. It's like, well, they're drunk, they know what they're doing, or, they're all members of this community, they're all adults. As soon as you're over 18, you're an adult, you know what you're doing. And it's really just used as another tool to blame the victim. It's used, many times prosecutors don't take cases. As soon as they hear alcohol's involved, whether it's the survivor or the perpetrator, they won't take a case. Because it's considered grave rape, and they don't even want to try to convince a jury. And that's why you often have the system so stacked against the survivor, whether it be the cop or the detective or the DA or the jury. I mean, it just seems as if one person is helping you, they don't guarantee that the rest of the system is going to help you out at all.
I mean, I can support that from being in law enforcement, but that's, the stats are, 50% of rapes involve alcohol use by one party or both. And typically, the DAs don't want to touch it. They don't want to spend the money. It's too hard to get a jury to get past the own bias stacked towards the female, that if alcohol is involved, you should have known better, as if it's your fault. We were kind of talking about it earlier, and, the world is different for men and women. If a guy passes out drunk, typically he just gets written on or something with some markers, and that's the extent of it. If a female passes out, she gets gang raped. But they're not comparable. That's the culture we live in, and then we somehow blame the female for that, as if consent was derived by the fact that she passed out.
And then really quick point, bringing back the Steubenville case. I mean, the fact that this thing was filmed and that they had to prove it, I mean, think about that. I mean, it was literally filmed and put on Instagram, and that wasn't enough. And then he's not released. They were both released, right?
Yeah, 1 year, they got 1 year.
Yeah, they're already out.
Yeah.
So it's just like, in terms of violent, awful cases and 15 minutes worth of video footage, and they're still let out, what does it say for most of the cases?
So Lena, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I think that, what Drea, just echoing what Drea said about the amount of proof necessary to prove that your allegations might be true. I just think that, the general principle that I try to operate under is believing the victim by default. And sometimes there might be that, 2% of cases where, you believe someone who wasn't telling the truth. But that person also is likely hurting in some capacity. Because people that are making up something as serious as sexual assault likely need some sort of help in another way. But I think that the default position of believing victims is a great place to operate under. If you're, listening to this panel and you want to see a way in which you can, in your everyday, try to make the culture a different culture, the way to do that is if somebody says, I've been assaulted, you don't say, well, were you drinking, or what were you wearing, or well, are you sure? You say to that person, well, do you need help? How can I help you? Do you need help? Do you need to go to the counseling center or the police station or to report this? Or even if you don't. But I just think that we have to approach this in the way that we respond to people who come forward in a more compassionate way than we are right now. And that's, I think, maybe step one. That's a really easy thing to do from this point on.
Thank you. So as we work to move beyond a rape culture, what different options and solutions do we have? What role should education programs, such as ones that focus on bystander intervention or teaching men not to rape, and policies and government initiatives such as California Senate Bill 967, Student Safety Sexual Assault, and the White House Task Force to Protect Students from Sexual Assault have as we move forward?
All right, so a lot of what I like to ask whenever I go to schools is how many of you know what Title IX is? Okay, how many of you know what it is beyond the context of sports? Right, fewer hands. Okay, so Title IX is a gender equity law, right? And it means that everyone in this room has an equal opportunity to an educational experience, so all educational programs, not just sports, right? Within that is also a climate free of sexual harassment and sexual assault. So there's literally a law that's in place to help protect you from anything happening. And if it does happen, for you to have an educational experience that is comparable to the person, right? So if you go to a school where people are being assaulted or they're being harassed and they can't go to classes, they can't go to the library, they can't feel like students, then you're not having an equal education. And I think, so few students actually know that's there. I mean, I recently talked to, one of my friend's little sisters who knew what frat not to go to not get raped, but didn't know what Title IX was. And, those are actually in the same conversation. I mean, if you literally can't go to certain places because you're afraid of getting raped, you're not really having an equal education. And I think like a lot of what I do when I work with survivors is like, you need to know your rights. Because if you feel like a professor saying something during a class that's making you feel uncomfortable, if you have a student who says like, oh, I'll help you during class if you give me a blowjob, or like you can't enter your dorm room unless you have sex with me, like that's not okay. Like it isn't just sexual assault. I mean, if you literally feel unsafe at school, like you have a right to an equal education. And I think it starts with that. It starts with the fact that like, it's not about waiting for you to get sexually assaulted. It's not about it being like, it has to be a certain type of experience for it to count, right? Like you literally have the right to be a student. Like you come to school to be a student. Like you shouldn't have to be afraid for your life. And I think like it really does start with that. And that's where like, the Yes Means Yes bill is so instrumental as well, because like you're gonna enter school knowing like what counts as sex and what counts as rape. And that's a very important conversation because like a lot of what I see at schools is that students have no idea what to do if it happens. I feel like we get a lot of information over what to do to prevent it, but when it happens, like you Google like 4 different places and you can't find out what to do. I mean, like if you Google a lot of schools, like if you Google UNC how to report rape, you're gonna get like 10 pages of why you shouldn't do it. Like student expelled, student charged with honor court because you tried doing it. Same thing with so many schools. Like you just see schools, you know, be accused of not dealing with this well, but I don't see any schools like really rushing to support survivors. And I don't really see there be a lot of resources for survivors when they actually want to get help. And a lot of what I see too is like, you know, one thing is that direct service and the bystander intervention and actually helping prevent sexual assault. Another thing is becoming a community and helping that survivor become a student again. Because one thing is that immediate rape kit and reporting, another thing is going back to classes, concentrating, dealing with PTSD, dealing with depression, you know, dealing with being able to feel safe and going home again. Like, I don't see a lot of that rush support, and y'all have great advocates here, but again, like, one thing is moving beyond that immediate support, and another thing is actually helping that survivor be one of you again. Because it's very scary. Like, I took a semester off after being sexually assaulted. You know, when I came back to school, I never felt like a student again. Like, I barely went to school events. I barely went to basketball games. We were literally in the national championship and I didn't want to go. And it was very hard for me to become a student again because it felt like nobody else understood what I dealt with. And I knew there were other survivors, but there simply wasn't a community. And I think that's a very important step. Like, we need to start supporting survivors and making sure that they know that they're believed and not alone, and there's a community there waiting to support them.
Thank you. Conrad?
It's a difficult question. In psychology, what we found, the best therapies tend to include what's called the wraparound approach, which means that you get multiple different components working together to help the patient overcome whatever it is that they're dealing with. You know, when you look at the stats, you're almost 4 times more likely to be raped between the ages of 16 and 19 than at any other time in your life, and yet sex education is one of the few things that your parents can opt you out of. And of course, they're not opting you out of much as far as what we've already been talking about in terms of if the actual education is beneficial. So, you know, it's really, it's systemic. We need to make tremendous changes, and it starts, you know, with somebody writing legislation. And, you know, we've kind of we were talking earlier before the event how people are starting to make changes, but now it's like, where do we have the resources? How do we get the resources together that we need to actually help facilitate the direction we're trying to go? You know, social change takes time, and we've seen this with the women's rights movements and women's suffrage movements, and we've seen it with racism, but we make significant changes. It just takes time, and it requires a dedicated approach that carries through the generations. And it seems like with women's issues, we talked briefly about, you know, the boom in the 70s with, you know, Susan Faludi and some of the other feminist writers of the time, but you know, then there was a date rape backlash that happened in the 90s if you kind of study it. So the problem is we dropped the ball, and it's almost like trying to pick up and start the momentum again. So it's going to take a multi-generational approach.
Thank you. Zerlina?
I think one of the things that I want to highlight is the teaching men not to rape portion of the question, because I think that that's number one. And just really broadening the conversation to include men in a really engaging way as a part of the conversation. We're talking about masculinity. And even just to use an example, today, Hollaback released a video about street harassment, where literally they just put a hidden camera on a woman who walked around New York City for 10 hours. And the video just shows you what it's like to be a woman walking around for 10 hours. She was wearing a regular, you know, a crew neck shirt and jeans. So one of the things that was really important about that video in particular is that it shows that even someone saying, you know, good morning or hi, you know, while that sounds benign out of context, when it's, you know, the 97th person to say something to you while you're just trying to, you know, get to work, get home, you know, go to yoga class, whatever you're trying to do in your day, that, that 87th person make a comment about your appearance, just again reiterates that men feel entitled to your body, and men feel entitled to your response, your smile at their compliment or their comment to you as you're just trying to go about your day. And so that's one of those everyday dynamics that I think that folk can relate to, and it can be instructive in this conversation, because really do need to teach men to behave in a different way. Because the way that they are behaving, it's not so good. And that's not all men, right? Hashtag not all men. That's not all men. But I think that the men that understand it and understand that this dynamic can lead to violence down the line and is unhealthy on a spectrum, can talk to their friends and become allies and active bystanders, so that sexual assaults just are not happening at the same rate. Because the only way you do that, it's not by telling women to not wear heels or wear a skirt. The way you do that is by making sure that the rapist who's in that room is giving a different choice. And when they don't get a yes, that they're not going to then pursue, anything further sexually. So I think that this is a conversation that needs to be broadened out to include men. It's essential that this conversation include men, because they need to be talking to each other about how to behave differently, so that violence doesn't happen at this rate anymore.
Thank you. Do any of the speakers have anything else they'd like to add?
And I think it's also important to address the fact that, men are also victims too, right? I mean, one of the more controversial surveys, MIT just released their climate survey, and it's one of the first in the country. And, there are a couple dozen men that, admitted to having either experienced harassment or assault while being enrolled at MIT. It isn't just women, it's something that it impacts everyone, and it really is important to bring everyone into the conversation.
I'll just add one point about protecting the male ego. When I do seminars, which I do a lot of seminars for sexual assault groups and sex trafficking groups, one of the things that I do to try to get men to understand what the world is like, if you ask men and you talk to them about what their greatest fear is about women, what's your greatest fear? It's rejection. You don't want to ask somebody out, put it out there, and get rejected, and have a strike to your ego. If you ask women what their greatest fear is, it's to be raped and murdered and mutilated, all the other things that happen. I did a guest lecture at Sac State in a sociology class on during a semester where there was 8 sexual assaults that happened within one semester. And to try to kind of hit that home, I asked all the men in the room, in the class, I said, what have you guys done? And everybody's aware of the sexual assault series, and I said, what have you guys done to change your routine around campus? And all the guys looked at me kind of strange, like, what are you talking about? And then I asked the women, tell me one thing you've done to change your routine because of the series. And every woman in the room raised their hand, and every one of them had something that they were doing.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add? Great. Please join me in just thanking all of our speakers. So now, people from the audience have any questions, we would love to hear them, so you can come up to a mic and ask a question. The mic by the podium, there you go.
Can I just go from here?
Yeah.
Because of our college campuses, especially in the 5 Cs, it's very small, and I think that I would venture to say that most of the sexual assaults that happen on this campus are even higher than for people that know each other than most situations. And I've heard a lot of instances where they try and other the perpetrator, and it's just not possible because they are their friends, they are members of our community. And how can we increasingly support our survivors when they really are maybe even one of your good guy friends or something like that?
Just anyone jump in.
I couldn't hear the whole question. Some of it I heard, but it was a good question, so go, Drea.
I think that strikes to what we've kind of already mentioned, that you gotta bring men into the equation, and you have to attack the general ego that's associated with, you know, what is kind of an old patriarchal type of view of the world. So if we don't do that, then you're going to continue to have women stigmatized. You know, what happens when it's the high school football star that sexually assaults a girl? Rather than us rally behind her, we basically rally behind the guy who gets his name called all the time Friday night at the football game because that's more fun and entertaining. So that's part of the whole cultural phenomenon, you know, of bringing this out, having real dialogues about it, and helping people understand the real serious effects of sexual assault.
And I think jumping on that, I think it still comes back to the fact that a lot of us don't know what sexual assault looks like unless it happens to us or we meet somebody else, right? Because oftentimes that person, you know, that male friend, you know, might have done to someone else. And it isn't until, you know, you have a conversation with one of your friends and it's like, well, you know, he did that to me too. And actually the other day, you know, I worked with a law student who had an experience with one of the scholarship students. And, you know, she felt very unsafe. She hadn't been sexually assaulted, but by talking to one of her other members of her cohort, you know, she realized that he had done it to other people. He had targeted people that looked a certain way. You know, he came off as very charming, very successful, had the best grades in the class. And, you know, after a while, they realized that that common friend they had was actually a perpetrator and that he was targeting all of them. And, you know, it was really hard for her to have the conversation with the dean and later the Title IX coordinator, because it's like, you know, I thought I knew this guy, and now all of a sudden I feel very unsafe and I don't know why. And I think it really does come back to really having the conversation over, this issue is very intimate. You know, oftentimes it's that person that you met in orientation, it's that person that you had a class with, it's that person that you admired on the soccer field, on the football field. You know, and that gets really scary because that's often even harder. Like, for example, Jameis Winston, you know, who was the star quarterback at FSU. I mean, nobody wants to target Jameis Winston. And I think, like, even though I have friends who have told me that they've been sexually assaulted at FSU, and like a lot of what they talk about just seems as definitely being sexually assault. Like, nobody wants to touch Jameis Winston. It just seems as if he's so great that it's impossible for us to think that he could have done that. And I think it really does just come back to the fact that we need to really understand that sex and rape are different. And until we have more dialogues of what rape looks like, it's going to be really hard for us to really recognize what it looks like in our intimate spheres.
Serlina?
I couldn't hear the full question. Was it about if the perpetrator is your friend? I heard that part.
Yeah, especially at a small school, and like the 5 colleges here.
Yeah, I get that question a lot also, and I think that that's a really tough one because, you know, as I'm a survivor and I was raped by someone I knew. It was actually my roommate's boyfriend, so it was somebody I considered a friend. So you have that dynamic that the person who's actually perpetrating the violence is someone that you're friends with, but also you have, you know, the situation where someone could come to you like you described and say, you know, this person, you considered that person a friend, and I just think that we have to look at it, again, going back to what Conrad said in the beginning. I think that's crucial, the behavior. It's a behavior. You're not necessarily, you know, it's a crime as well. So it's something that someone did. It is not necessarily like Jake is a bad human being forever. You have to, you know, he might be because he committed this crime and that makes him a bad human being. That could be the logical conclusion of that sentence. But I think that you have to look at behavior and the red flags in that behavior. So is your friend, you know, targeting people like Dre was just saying, targeting specific people and, you know, manipulating them emotionally and sexually and taking advantage of people? Do they have an MO? I mean, a lot of times people do the same thing over and over. That's why there's so many you know, cases where a perpetrator rapes, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 or more women on the same campus because they have the same behavior. So if we're focusing on the behavior, not necessarily the person as a whole, I think that it's easier then to look at your friend and say, you know, you committed a crime and you have to be held accountable for that. You know, we don't send you off the island. That's not what happens. But I think that it's important to take this way more seriously, and that I think starts by looking at the behavior. Going back to what Conrad said, because I think that's a part that I think I want to hone in on.
And I think jumping really quickly, you know, I'm a little removed from college, and I live in a big city like LA. But I remember very much what it's like to be on a college campus and having all your friends know each other and thinking like, what if I tell somebody that this happened to me, like, will I lose my entire friend group? And sometimes that happens. Sometimes you'll have a survivor be completely isolated and ostracized from their community because they thought that what happened to them was sexual assault, even though some other person might have had a similar experience. And that's because, especially small schools like this are very intimate, and you're very far away from a big city, and this becomes your home for 4 years. And the thought of your home not being safe is very scary. And I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that at small schools, it's often even harder to come forward.
Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add?
Hello? I just have a question about the MIT study that you said, with 10% men. Was it same-sex or heterosexual assault?
Yeah, so it's actually, if you just go to the New York Times, it's on their front page. It's like, it's today's paper. Yeah. So it's a huge, like, 70-page survey, but it's actually broken up by categories. So they have race, they have sexuality, they have gender identity, and actually, like, students who identify as transgender or gender nonconforming are their own category, and students who identify as LGBT are also their own category. So it's actually just, it's targeting the gender itself. So students who identify as male are, in that specific instance, are the ones that reported sexual assault or harassment. And what's also interesting is it also talks about like where it occurred and how it was different. Because what's interesting is we know how MIT is and what we think of MIT. And the harassment is a lot lower in the classroom, but it's a lot higher outside of the classroom. And students feel a lot safer on campus, but a lot less safe in other buildings. So it really does break up where these students feel unsafe and where the problems are. But it's a really interesting survey. I really recommend you read it.
So I have a couple of questions, and most of them are interrelated with how men perhaps construct their identity in the environment that they're socialized in. So you guys talked a lot about how rape is a taught behavior. And I wonder how you initiate a conversation with men, with friends, with people, you know, who haven't assaulted, or you don't expect to assault, or you've never been told have, you know, in certain instances like we heard that, you know, you don't sometimes know. How do you initiate conversation where men define themselves or view themselves as being a certain, or have to live up to a certain ideal of masculinity? How do you unteach that socialized behavior? Like, how do you, while I understand where, you know, I understand that ideal, I understand what we're trying to get at. Sometimes I'm frustrated by how you initiate that conversation, how you disassociate that almost forceful, violent sexual identity from men's vastly created narrative. And then we talked about drinking or substance use and its correlation with sexual assault or sexual violence. And we talk more from the survivor's point of view and how there's victim blaming, but perhaps shifting the focus to where perpetrators have been drinking. And we talk about how inhibitions are lowered. Why is it then that men feel like they have a right to force themselves on women? And how you could perhaps change that. Again, maybe it goes back to how you perhaps break down the idea of rape and how normalized it is in common discourse. But for you know, men that I go to school with, how do you change that now? Comment? I'm sorry.
That's long. So, you know, when it comes to part of the cultural change, we have missed opportunities. You know, we use the term teachable moment. So we talked about the Ohio rape case, and you can go home and Google the 12-minute video.
Don't look it up, it's really bad. Just huge trigger warning, like that is one of the worst things I've ever seen in my entire life, just a warning.
It is, it's horrific. Look, my degree, you know, I study serial killers and rapists and things like that. It's hard to shock me, and that video shocked me, okay? And part of why it shocked me is because I grew up, you know, If my mother hadn't been victimized, I probably wouldn't be sitting here. I was a jock, I was a starter on a state championship football team, and been a cop and a kickboxer, and I understand the male culture and the locker room talk, and that's very difficult. It's difficult to break those chains. But when you have teachable moments, in that video, there is a bright light amongst this just horrific use of the word rape. I mean, them joking and talking about this girl's rape. Now, when I was younger in the locker room, if guys were joking about somebody raping somebody like that, you would have got beaten up. We didn't talk about the word rape like that. Now, we might have talked about having a party or having some alcohol, but to use the word rape, laughing, saying she's so raped and she's so dead, and you have to watch the video to really understand the gravity of it and see where these young boys have slipped to. In that video there are a couple, about 2 to 3 young men who actually say, man, that's not cool. They raped her. That was rape, man, that's not cool. Those kids should have been given national spotlight. We should have found out who they were and put them on every news station known and had them speak. On top of that, there's another bright light. I was carving pumpkins with my kids this Sunday, and I had a football game on in the background. And they have nomore.org, and you had professional football players. We need these types of people coming out and saying and giving a message that there's no more domestic violence, no more sexual assault. And that's something I can't break through the barrier to go talk to football teams. It's a closed door. So I can gain access anywhere I want to speak on this topic, but trying to get into a high school football team, it's nearly impossible, even working with sexual assault agencies in the particular counties that I work. So those doors will get cracked open when we start getting the support from NFL and NBA players, and that's what we need. We have to force that issue.
Thank you. Zerlina?
Yeah, actually, that's such an important point to bring up about certain entities taking the lead on this issue. And so while the conversation seems to be had primarily led by and among men, I think that if the NFL stood up tomorrow and said, we are not going to tolerate any instances of domestic violence, this policy that we put out where you get a lifetime ban after your third offense, that's offensive. We should never have done that. We really have a no tolerance policy, and we're going to train our players from the beginning, so that they're having those healthy interactions in their private lives. Because I think that while the focus on the NFL sometimes allows the general population to say, oh, that's just a problem for football players, or that's just a problem for athletes, or some other community that's not my own. Sometimes you think that it's not a problem that you can help to fix. And so I think that the important thing is that I thought that James Brown, who's the CBS announcer for the NFL, I think that it was the second week of the season when he made a statement about masculinity. Because that was an amazing moment. It wasn't one that I can remember seeing really in my lifetime in that way. And I think that that's a moment that we just need to repeat over and over and over again in a bigger and bigger way. And I think it's really, gives me a lot of optimism that you have people in the White House that get it, right? People in the White House that understand that this is a conversation that we need to include men and boys in. We need to be talking about masculinity and bystander intervention. That wasn't coming from the White House, at any other moment that I can recall. In history. So this is a time where we just need to be continuing having to have these conversations, albeit, sometimes they're uncomfortable, they're really important because it has to do with the fact that we want to be able to protect and care about each other. We don't want our friends and family members or even ourselves to be victimized or violated in this way. And so I think that by having these conversations, by allowing entities like the NFL to take the lead on this issue, and then in our own lives having those conversations, we can change the culture because like someone said at the beginning of the panel, drunk driving used to be something we used to joke about. It was hilarious. And then obviously we can all remember times in our childhood where Moms Against Drunk Driving had the, wrecked car outside of our high school, and that changed the way that we viewed that issue. And so I think the same thing is true of rape and sexual assault. And it's really just continuing to have conversations like we had tonight, and then also on an individual level. And then hopefully we have those big entities like the NFL take the lead, so that then trickles down and those conversations are already happening.
And I think jumping on that, I think it really just comes back to the fact that there really isn't a deterrent for rape. I mean, it's just like, it's kind of tutored off as being, this really high profile felony. If it happens, you go off to prison for life. That simply doesn't happen. I mean, we know that these assaults happen, often among young people. Young people are the most targeted. You don't see people being arrested on college campuses. It doesn't happen. And not that prison is the solution for this. It definitely has to be a cultural thing that has really shifted among us. But there really isn't a deterrent for this problem. I mean, what we're seeing even within free speech. I wrote a paper when I was in college called The Politics of the First Amendment. And what we see is oftentimes when women speak their minds and they share their opinions, they're often a threat. I mean, Shalina and I have both gotten rape and death threats. Often it doesn't stop. Sometimes you get mail. Sometimes when I was in college, I had my dorm broken into after I started speaking about sexual assault. Someone left a knife behind to make sure that I knew what would happen if I continued talking. Recently a feminist speaker canceled her talk on campus because she got threats. Where you have George Will go to give a talk about survivor privilege, and he's not getting any threats. Rather, he's getting $45,000. So again, the politics of equality really need to be debunked. And we need to really understand that, it's just not a safe place for women. And we really need to start creating a deterrent, not for coming forward, but for actually committing these crimes.
Anything else?
Wasn't there a second part about alcohol? I think the first part, so would you mind repeating it, maybe?
That's how you have the conversation.
I'm not sure. Did we cover that? We did? Okay. All right, so?
You can talk to us after.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for coming. I think this is a very important conversation that needed to be had. I guess my question is really short. Do you believe that Jane Doe reporting should be compulsory on all college campuses?
Oh, so you mean mandatory reporting? In general?
But anonymous reporting, Jane Doe reporting.
Yeah, so it's complicated because there are overlapping laws on college campuses. You have the Clery Act and you also have Title IX. And technically right now under Title IX, whenever a survivor tells somebody who's a mandatory reporter, which is technically an employee of the university, including RAs, it's technically reported. So that's actually created a big chill on campus because you don't really have anyone confidential to talk to. And I think if there were this kind of honest approach at helping survivors, I think, people would report, right? They would come forward. But I think what happens oftentimes is survivors are silenced, what I'm seeing in a lot of schools is there's this mandatory reporting, where you can't even trust your RA. And oftentimes universities kind of make survivors go through a complaint process. They often scare them from getting resources, and those survivors end up never telling anyone ever again. And a lot of if you really want to look into it, it's interesting, institutional betrayal, which is actually a whole study on what it's like, for a person who comes forward. And oftentimes if they get one victim blaming response, they never tell anyone ever again, whether it be a hospital or be a police department or be a school. I think the idea of higher numbers is great, but there definitely has to be many more resources and much better response for that survivor to actually get the support they need, because it really isn't just about numbers, right?
In law enforcement, once you get past the reporting part and a cop comes out, we have what are called confidentiality forms for certain types of crimes, and sex assaults are one of them, which means all throughout the report we don't use your name, we just put victim, in there, V1. If there's multiple, then we, number them. But at some point, you got to go to court. So yeah, you can make the report confidential, but at some point, you got to go to court, you got to testify. And it's tough. It's tough just because of the psychological nature of sexual assault. And there again, we talk about wraparound services. Many survivors talk about the re-victimization that happens through the process. And so that's one of the most challenging things for us to do, is figure out how to develop a process for justice while helping somebody who is either suffering acute stress disorder or ultimately post-traumatic stress disorder, depending on how long the process took. How do we do that? And that's what we were talking about earlier. You know, we don't have all the resources in place yet to be able to really facilitate that.
There are no avenues for survivors to anonymously report without beginning criminal proceedings.
Well, we have victim surveys. We get stats from victim surveys, but you know, there's not a lot of once you make a report to a mandatory reporter, which is where typically you'd be going for services related to the trauma, then yeah, you run into that problem.
And I think it really depends what you're talking about, whether it be law enforcement or schools, because they are completely different systems, and they're often not even tethered, right? So for example, like I reported my rape in an anonymous system, and it was actually created by a fellow student who basically, you know, she put a box on the bathroom wall, and you could report your sexual assault that way. And this was before mandatory reporting was a thing, and this was in 2012. So it's changed a little bit, but it really did help me because I did become that Jane Doe. You know, I was just a number. And the reason I didn't report my sexual assault was because I didn't know who my perpetrator was, and people they did a very good job of making sure I didn't find out who it was. But it's really difficult for that to happen nowadays, and a lot of what schools are doing is they're offering survivors the opportunity to blind or anonymously report. And basically the only way that they would be called back is if it would be seen as a serial problem. So if you reported one person and someone else did, then you would be called back. But besides that, they wouldn't call you back. So you have that option, and schools usually offer you that option if you would like to do it.
Zerlina, anything?
Well, I think just in terms of the reporting for law enforcement, which is like Dre said, just really different than when you're on campus, is a lot of people sometimes bring up that solution. And I didn't hear the full question, but I'm just going based on their responses, sort of like aiming at where I think the question was. But part of the problem with relying on law enforcement or even reporting as the solution to this problem. Like, we're identifying as a crime, and obviously we all know that when crimes are committed, that somebody needs to be punished. But even before that, when we're just, you know, pointing to the criminal justice system and saying, well, law enforcement should take care of that rape problem, I think that we're obfuscating our own responsibility for, you know, preventing those bad behaviors way before they even get to the point where there's a sexual assault taking place, or serial sexual offender perpetrating on one particular campus or in one community. And so I just think that the law enforcement angle, so few rapists actually end up in jail, even if they do go to trial. That's just not the solution that I hang my hat on at all. I think that the cultural piece, the conversation piece, the changing everyday behaviors and the way people think about this issue is more where I put my energies. Because, like, you know, Conrad Andreas said as well, law enforcement ends up being, it's not a solution that ultimately is when we're, you know, I think that's going to solve this problem. We're not going to put all the rapists in jail because we're not putting any rapists in jail hardly right now.
Well, I don't know if any of you have read on it, but another specific problem with law enforcement is look at all the thousands and thousands of rape cases that we just don't process. That literally just don't process. So it's definitely it's difficult to use law enforcement when you're talking about tax-based revenue to be able to solve these problems. There's limited resources, and unfortunately they tend to get shifted away from sexual assault cases unless it is a serious outcome.
How have communities of faith interacted and engaged with the issues and culture surrounding sexual assault, and how can they to support survivors?
You say communities of faith?
Yeah, like religious communities. Yeah.
Well, I think in a lot of college campuses, oftentimes, you know, communities of faith and especially religious leaders are instrumental in actually providing that confidential resource, because there aren't really many, right? You know, on college campuses, it's really just therapists and really religious leaders. So in schools that have chaplains, oftentimes those chaplains are really tasked with a lot of people who are coming forward. And a lot of what we're seeing is just like, they often don't feel like they can even engage with the school Because oftentimes schools, kind of have their own system. They don't really bring in religious leaders, where oftentimes people really do withdraw to their faith when it comes to healing from sexual assault. And I think there definitely have been really powerful, survivors that have come forward talking about their faith. But I really haven't seen a lot of schools really reach out to religious communities, more than just as an offering as a confidential resource. And I feel like it's really a largely untapped resource.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, in my experience, and I've been involved in this for about 20 years. The last 10 years, we've seen some real progress in that particular field. There's a lot of churches now that have domestic violence shelters that are their own run domestic violence shelters. If you go back prior to that, I've dealt with and worked with a lot of survivors who lost their faith or struggled with their faith because they were, and this is more related to domestic related sexual assault and domestic or interpersonal violence, where they would go to talk to their minister and they would kind of get told to pray for your husband and they would kind of get left alone. And that was more of something that would happen 10 or more years ago. I've seen a significant change in the faith community in the last 10 years, but I agree that it is an incredibly untapped resource. And in many cases, like for instance, the faith-based communities are one of the few communities that are doing anything about sex trafficking right now. As far as shelters, resources, they're over in Cambodia, they're over in Tanzania, they're in, the sex trafficking shelter that I work with in Lincoln, which is a small little area, they're the only one in the business. And, we have roughly about 100,000 trafficked women and children in this country. In 2010, we saved 1,600 of them. That was it.
And I think a random note, I just remember an anecdote. When I researched at the University of Oregon in Eugene, the Wesley Center was amazing for survivors of sexual assault. The director is a survivor himself of child abuse, and especially when the school came under fire, he put up a big sign, if you're a survivor, you're safe here. And he welcomed everyone of all denominations or not at all, and he was just so supportive, and he held so many programs, again, faith-based or not, just to support survivors. And I think, again, it's a very, largely untapped resource, and I think it really is instrumental to helping on the problem.
Thank you. Zerlina?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an untapped resource, but I would also say that faith communities likely have to be educated on, the same, series of issues that we've been talking about all evening, because I just have to say, I'm the daughter of two ministers, and so, you already have really, really complicated feelings and things that you're taught growing up if you're in a really, really strict religious community or family. And so there's all those complicated feelings and emotions around sex anyway. If you have to go to, your church and say, well, I was drinking at a frat party and I was sexually assaulted, that's a lot of red flags for, some communities. So I think that the education needs to, those communities, those faith groups, they also need to be educated on, how properly to deal with survivors so that they're not also blaming them when they're, coming in to seek help. Like Andrea and Conrad said, it's an untapped resource because, by and large, Catholic churches are in communities to serve that community. And so I think that maybe we can get the Catholic Church to take, I guess that would be sort of ironic, but maybe they can take a bigger role in trying to help communities deal with this particular issue, because it starts with education, and it's not that there's any one space that does this perfectly. I think it's an ongoing conversation. But I think that the church is a place in which first we have to confront sort of the patriarchal view, that men can do whatever they want to their wives or their girlfriends, sort of that in a possessive way, that some religions teach. First we have to confront that, but in those spaces where entities are willing and they want to help survivors, absolutely we must take that as a resource, because I think we need all hands on deck here.
Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I have two definitely unrelated questions. I'm cheating right now. The first is, I was wondering, especially you, Zelina, with your legal background, what's your guys' general reactions, and also how the mainstream advocacy community is reacting to the defense that's coming out of Vanderbilt. I'm sure you've heard about this. that the lawyer in the Vanderbilt case, which was similar to the Steubenville, where there was a recording, that they're sort of using the defense that worked in Tennessee. In another case, that the individual themselves, the football player in this case, was too drunk to commit the act of rape. And I asked this in sort of under the umbrella of when we talk about alcohol in connection to sexual assault, especially on campuses, we really place the emphasis on how we have to ignore alcohol as a factor and sort of exonerate people for their actions and not blame them for the actions because of alcohol. So I'm wondering how you feel like this legal defense, which is of course shady and in my opinion shameful and upsetting, but also one that sort of reflects almost a turnaround of the way that we talk about alcohol with these issues. Wondering what your comment is on that. And also, sorry, I am cheating. I'm wondering if in your experience with the mainstream advocacy, sort of on the national stage, where you see the 4 out of 5 women that are on college campuses right now that have not directly experienced, that are not survivors, that are not males who are going to be challenged in these conversations with ideas of masculinity and challenging themselves. Where do you see the other women who have not yet been personally victimized by this issue but are constantly at risk and who are constantly getting a sort of dual opinion from white mainstream feminism that, hey, you should not worry about what you wear and go out, it's all about the man who's trying to attack you, and I think also race and class definitely plays into this. I realize I'm cheating by talking a lot. I'm not a student anymore too, so you can't kick me out, the students. I'm an alumni. But anyway, so I'm wondering what you think the role should be of other women who cannot yet identify as survivors, and we hope never have that opportunity, but are also not really engaged in this conversation through sort of the masculinity lens that most of the, advocacy groups are talking about. I'm sorry for the late.
Well, for the first part of the question, you actually asked a really specific legal question because the presence of alcohol when you are perpetrating a crime versus being victimized are completely different. So this defense, it sounds similar to the Steubenville defense because it's saying she was too drunk, so we don't know if she consented, we're not sure. And in this case where they're saying he was too drunk to know what he was doing, basically. At least in my understanding, in New York law, and generally common law states that you have to be I think like there's a funny thing when you're studying actually and learning about this. There is a spectrum of drunkenness in which you have to be, in which that can be an actual legal defense for you. And just like for the record. The defense that I was so drunk that I didn't mean to rape that person is not going to work. The distinction there, though, and there was a case similar to the one you're talking about in New York, where there was a sex worker who was sexually assaulted here, and the defense was actually no, it was not that case. It was a different case, but around the same time, where 2 New York police officers sexually assaulted a woman who had been drinking, woke up in and out of consciousness during the attack, and that defense worked, that she was too intoxicated to be a reliable witness, but that argument doesn't work. I don't know if it will. It shouldn't work. Let's just say that. It should not work. That the perpetrator is so drunk that he can't be guilty of the crime. That's just not how the law is constructed. So that's the answer to the first question.
Okay, so jumping really quick on absurd defenses, there was another case in New York where the defense was he was too drunk to have an erection, therefore he could not have raped her. And it was like the whole thing was my penis was flaccid. And that was the whole thing. It was like he's like I have a sex disorder that when I drink I cannot get an erection. And that was his defense. Like it wasn't that it didn't happen, it wasn't that there wasn't penetration, it was that there was no erection because he was drunk. So again, they like to say it's like, oh, it couldn't have been rape. And I think again, it's because we don't have that conversation over what actually is rape. And like I was saying earlier about the way the statutes work, oftentimes they just come up with these absurd defenses just so it doesn't look like what the rape statute says. So I think is it effective? I would hope it's not. But at the same time, sometimes it has been, right? Well, there have been people who have gone away with murder, right? So it's the same way with sexual assault.
from a legal standpoint, the criminal justice system does allow for excuse defenses and justification defenses. So self-defense, for example, is a justification. And intoxication is part of the excuse defenses, but it's usually used for urinating in public or breaking, you go into the wrong home because you're so drunk you don't pay attention that it's not your house, it's the house next door. Things like that. And we also, from the standpoint of the survivor, for consent, intoxication in California law is listed under one of the rape statutes where, if you're too intoxicated to give consent. Unfortunately, I can see how they're playing that legal game. I get it, but a prosecuting attorney that wants to hire somebody to talk about how erections work in the brain could probably beat that down pretty simply. The question is, are they going to do that? Because you have to have a certain level of cognition to be able to gain arousal. And it's different for all of us. That's one of the things that's different about pedophiles. Their brains are wired differently. And so they gain arousal towards prepubescent children. And that's literally a different wiring in their brain. So I think you could attack that. It just would require money.
I was thinking less about is this defense going to work? More, how do you think that because alcohol and rape culture are so pervasive on college campuses specifically, and this is an instance that is all about rape culture and alcohol use on a college campus, how do you think sort of turning the tables on how we think about alcohol's position in these rape cases, how does that affect sort of the overall argument that alcohol consumption should be completely ignored? I'm talking about sort of separate from the legal thing, but thank you for your interest.
Well, I think jumping on that, you were saying earlier about Europe and how it is really in any other part of the country. I mean, alcohol, this is specifically on American campuses. And sexual assault happens in Canada, it happens in Australia, it happens in countries, in every single country. But the way we frame alcohol is very different. We very much, it's something that is, it's part of the experience, even though it's technically illegal until you're 21. Everyone expects to go through that phase. If you ask anybody, it's like, oh yeah, I did that when I was in college. And it's kind of just expected to be something that you go through, and it's part of the college experience. And the thing is, it's framed that way. It's framed as something that you do in college and everybody does. Because if we're going to expel every single kid that's underage drinking, you're not going to have anybody on campus. And that's just how it is, right? So a lot of it is just like that. They frame it that way. They frame it as it being something that is part of the college experience.
Did we get the second part?
Yeah, the second was mostly, what do you think those who aren't survivors, those who aren't a part of what is traditionally thought of as patriarchy, and those who aren't white, privileged feminists and openly expresses that, what do you think the role of the other people on college?
I haven't answered that question. Yeah, so I think it's important for us to look at just feminism as it is a privilege to even know about feminism. Before I went to college, I was a low-income, first-generation Latina. No one in my neighborhood went to college. I was the first person in my school to get an acceptance letter, and one of 4 who even went to a 4-year university. So when I go back home, nobody knows what I do. I have to break it down, and it's okay. Sometimes I don't get it, and half my family doesn't speak English, and they never will understand it. And I think it's important to recognize the fact that we can have these conversations. And it's not just race, it's not just language, it's the fact that we can afford to go to a school, that we can even talk about this, and not just go to our classes and learn our profession, right? So I think it really is about, teaching women that what happens around us isn't okay. Because I think a lot of what I saw on college campuses is that there were so many people that had no idea this issue was happening. I mean, my first semester of college, I had so many student athletes in my dorm that had no idea these conversations were happening. I had this one golfer who couldn't go to survivor support sessions because they were during her trainings. And she couldn't talk to anybody because she was only taking psychology courses and pharmacy courses because she wanted to be a pharmacist. So she had no opportunity to even talk about this. She may say things that are problematic in feminist spheres. Is she a person who's not an ally? Absolutely not. She's just someone who cannot have these conversations. And the same can be said of community college students. And the same can be said of students who just don't feel like they have a space to be able to talk about this. And I think it really is important to bring everyone to the conversation and to create spaces that are beyond our echo chambers. Because it's so safe for us to have these conversations in spaces where we don't have heavy criticism. And a lot of my courses when I was in college were predominantly male dominated. I was often the only Latina in the class where I had to explain the fact that I wasn't an illegal immigrant, as I was called multiple times. And it was hard because it was just like, oh my God, like I can't have these conversations. But so many times in those courses where I approached by survivors that simply had never had the opportunity to be able to talk about their experience. And I think it really is up to all of us that have the privilege of these conversations to go into communities in which these aren't being had.
Does any of the panelists have anything else they'd like to add?
Well, as far as the women who aren't survivors, one of the things, unfortunately, that I'm learning as I get older, I'm about to be 33. I know I look young, but I'm about to be 33. Is that more and more of my friends and more women I come across are not, are also survivors and haven't talked about it at that point, but because, I write and talk about it all the time, people will reach out to me frequently, people that I never knew were survivors, more and more, particularly women of color, because the statistics are higher for Black and Latina women and Native women. And so I think that part of the problem is that we have maybe a false assumption that the number is as low as 1 in 5 or 1 in 4, and that's the number, that's the reported number. That's the reported number. So I think that once we realize and recognize that attempted or completed rape, that means that someone has, experienced unwanted contact that likely, left them traumatized in some way, big or small. There's so many times I was thinking all day because of that Hollaback video about street harassment. I was thinking all day about the times that I was almost raped, or the times that I was, groped, or the time that a man came up to me on the street in Europe and exposed himself. Like all of these other traumas that, wouldn't get, put in a box and said, well, this is sexual assault and I'm now a survivor. These are the kinds of things that are happening to these women that you're speaking about that wouldn't necessarily identify as survivors, right? These are all, we all have had a man touch us on the street when we didn't want them to, someone that we didn't know, and that, that's not okay as well, and also on that same spectrum. So I think that, like I said, unfortunately, so many different folks, as I get older, I'm finding that they're survivors also and just never talked about it. And I think that we can't think of the number as that low. We have to think that, there's so many people that haven't been comfortable talking about this, and maybe you can be that ally that they then come to because you've shown yourself to be someone who is willing and open and supportive of survivors. So that's, I guess, the answer to that question. The second question.
Does anybody else have anything you'd like to ask?
I can just add the stat. The DOJ estimates that only 39% of rapes are actually reported. So if you go off the numbers of 1 to 4 to 5, depending on the study, then you can kind of get a feel of what the gravity of the situation could be.
Great. Please join me in just another round of applause for tonight's panel.